Everyone, this is Dr. Pollock. As you can see here on the screen today, our main order of business is going to be discussing framing effects, specifically in the context of this Chong and Druckmann article you guys read and responded to for this week. We'll get to that in a second, but prior to that, I just wanted to give you what will probably serve as the final reminder of your semester project. So here, again, recall the due date is the 20th of April, so it's coming up very soon. On a practical note, you can see here there's now a link for you to turn the project in on Moodle, so you'll want to avail yourself of this link and submit your project whenever it's ready, of course. And this is a turn it in link to where we check for originality and whatnot. And I'm not going to go through the whole discussion on academic integrity again, but just note there is going to be an originality check. You'll turn in the project here on the 20th. I would say, just additional comments. This is getting repetitive at this point, I suppose, but I'll emphasize once more. If you have questions or concerns going into the due date here, let me know. I'd be happy to get in touch with you and talk about them. It sort of requires me knowing where you stand, though. At this point, I think I've talked to some of you. Many of you I've not talked to yet about your project. Those of you who I have been in contact with and discussed either on Zoom or via email, I think we've had productive discussions and clarified points of confusion or whatnot. And if you're in that situation to where you still have concerns, please let me know. I would say again, this has been my general approach to the semester here and the project as well, is that if you are having difficulties with it, given the circumstances, uh, let me know. I'm trying to be accommodating, and as I've said, generally I'm amenable to whatever your concerns and difficulties are. But again, this is something that requires you to be in communication with me, right? So if we get down to the due date here on the 20th, and I'm hearing from you, for the first time there, or on the 21st, the day after, or whatnot, and you tell me, well, I don't have the paper ready. What do I do? I'd like to avoid that situation. If you have foreseeable issues, let me know. I'd be willing to talk to you about them in terms of either the time frame of the project or whatever is going on with your project. Again, though, the key here is going to be communication between you guys and me as we approach a due date here. Okay, so that's all I had to say as far as the project goes at the moment. So let me return now to our notes and get started here with a discussion on framing effects. So the way I'm going to structure the discussion, I just want to start generally by recapping the nature of framing, what it is, when does it occur. These would be, in large measure, things that Chong and Druckmann discuss in the front half of their article that I wanted to go back over. In general, it's an article that uses, it's presented in a fairly rigorous, somewhat complex manner. And so this is, if you guys read through this and you got a lot of what I'm going to say, that's fine. But for some of you, maybe you didn't make sense of some of the language. And so I just want to go over some of the basics that they talk about as far as what framing is, how it occurs, what are the psychological underpinnings, in other words, in somebody's mind, what are the conditions needed for a framing effect to occur. So we'll have that discussion. Eventually, though, we'll refocus on the overall point of this paper. How do framing effects occur or sometimes not occur in competitive contexts? Okay, so the main insight here, the reason why this is a paper that gets published in a prominent venue in the journal, the APSR here is a pretty prominent journal. The reason it's recognized as a pretty important contribution to this literature is that it's looking at things from this competitive context. So in other words, it's doing things a little bit more faithfully to the information environment of the United States than the stylized information environment of an experiment, or most experiments where people are exposed to only one frame. And that's how, prior to this paper, most scholars would have studied framing effects, just in a non-competitive single frame context, which maybe doesn't match what we actually have in the real world in the United States of America. So we'll talk about that. To start out with, though, as I mentioned, I just wanted to get into making sure everyone is on the correct page as far as the definition and meaning of what framing is. So here, let's spend a few moments just going through just the basics of framing. So we're going to talk about what framing is, and then this term, what is a framing effect? Okay, I think it makes sense to illustrate these separately. They follow from one another. So framing, this is just emphasis or sometimes de-emphasis. Could work either way. Certain considerations in media coverage of a story. All right, so it happens to be the case with most issues. You can think of anything going on in the news, that there are usually multiple ways that the media could choose to cover it. They could choose to feature really prominently one thing, or they could choose to maybe neglect that thing and feature more prominently some other aspect of the story. This is just the nature of information, right? This is not anything that's surprising to anyone, I don't think. But there are different ways that you could choose to discuss, or in the media's case, cover different events or different stories. That's what we mean by framing, and nothing too complex, just the way in which the media chooses to emphasize or de-emphasize certain elements of a story. For our purpose, we're interested in not just framing in and of itself. We are interested in how framing is affecting public opinion. Okay, so there's a class on public opinion in the media, and this is again a way by which the media in its coverage can influence what the public thinks about political matters here. So if you recall, last week we talked about, I'll just go briefly, I'm not going to go back through the whole discussion, but these notes on the Iyengar et al. Paper, we talked about agenda setting, we talked about priming as different ways in which the media can affect public opinion. These framing effects are another way that can occur. Okay? So here, a framing effect is just any occurrence whereby individuals adopt different positions or we could say attitudes, which is maybe the parlance we've used more so in this class. People are adopting some different position or attitude under different frames. Okay, so this is the case in which framing the story one way leads people to have one position on the issue. Potentially framing it in a different way would lead people to have a different position on the issue. Okay, so framing effect, the framing effect here on attitudes toward where the story is. So this Chong and Druckmann paper, eventually their experiments are centered around the examples of urban development in one experiment, and then this white supremacist rally and a different experiment. We'll get into that, but just before we talk about the paper specifically, just to give you an example that this is an example I came across, I think a few years ago now, which I saved when I found it just because I thought it was a very good example of framing. If you guys recall, wasn't a super prominent story, so many of you may not have ever encountered this, but there's a story a few years ago discussing, as you can see, immigration and customs enforcement. They arrested, in this situation, a man who was driving his wife, to the hospital to give birth. Right? So this is a pregnant woman. The husband was driving the wife to the hospital. They were both unauthorized. I think both unauthorized. I don't recall the specifics. The husband was, as you can see, an unauthorized immigrant, and so he's detained by ICE on the way to give birth. Okay, so you can see the information I'm giving you right now. This is here, this is one way the story was framed, in other words, right? This was a screenshot of my phone from the Google News feed that I found on this when I was just from time to time browse the news on my phone. This is one way the story is covered. ICE arrests husband, taking pregnant wife to hospital to give birth, forcing her to drive alone. So in this case, the framing emphasizes the wife being pregnant. The framing emphasizes her having to go drive alone now. This is a really good example of framing, though, because in particular, one aspect of this story, which was de-emphasized, which actually features prominently in this next headline, the one above this one, you see here, these would be two different news sources, Democracy Now! In one case, and then People Magazine above this. People Magazine frames this headline around in this way: ICE arrests man allegedly wanted for homicide, okay, while driving pregnant wife to hospital for birth. Okay, so here, obviously a different element to this story being emphasized in this coverage of it, being de-emphasized in the framing of it here by Democracy Now! The point here being, for our purposes, when you give somebody this headline and ask them to evaluate, for instance, the appropriateness of ICE's actions, okay, should they have done this thing? Should they have arrested this person? Many people may arrive at the position of no, they probably shouldn't have arrested the guy on the way to the hospital, forcing the wife to drive alone. If you, on the other hand, were to present people with this framing of the story, okay, that the husband was suspected of homicide, probably more people would be in favor of ICE's action in this case. Okay, so what I just described, if that were to be true, if we would actually run that experiment and test this and find, okay, more people are in favor of ICE's actions up here than they are in this framing, that would be a framing effect. Okay, you present people with different framing of a story, again, emphasizing or de-emphasizing different elements of it, that's potentially leading them to different attitudes on the issue. Okay, that's what we mean by a framing effect. Those are my one example here. I'll obviously return to the framing of the hate group rally, the urban development program, the things that are going on in this paper that we're talking about. Prior to that, though, let's just talk about, I guess, getting back to the general question of media effects. Okay, so here, you recall this concept that we discussed last time, elite manipulation. Okay, so when I was giving you the history of the study of media effects, right, and we had the discussion, the hypodermic needle model, the minimal effects model, and then what Iyengar et al. Are saying about things like agenda setting and priming. Much of this comes down to this question of whether or not the media can be used as a route of elite manipulation or manipulation in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be elites, I suppose, but whether or not the media can be used to systematically drive the public in a particular direction. This is the normative concern, right? If it's the case that the media has its thumb on the scale and it can push the public wherever it wants, or in fact does that, that's a concern from the democratic perspective, right? We have it in mind that we have a populist electorate where people have different values, people have different positions, which they arrive at somehow, and the media's role is providing information. That's more or less what people, most people I would say is the appropriate role of the media, providing information so that people can come to whatever their positions are on an issue. If it's the case that framing, for instance, could be used to just push people in a particular direction, many people would be concerned with that. So here, one of the reasons that we study framing effects is to see how easy is it? Okay, how easily swayed are people by framing? Okay, is it the case here that we just, however we frame an issue, that's where people are going to go, or is there a more nuanced discussion there? To preview the findings here in the paper, there is the more nuanced effect going on, right? It's not as though any old frame can push people in any direction. There are only certain conditions under which framing effects will occur. And moreover, this competitive environment where oftentimes you'll have frames going in different directions prevent any one frame usually from becoming dominant. So that's one of the major normative implications here. That in terms of this question, can framing be used as a means of elite manipulation? This paper will alleviate some of those concerns, okay, which maybe you guys didn't have these concerns going into reading this paper, but if you read the literature review, I don't know how clearly it comes through, but that's one of the things Chung and Druckmann are speaking to, just the ease with which framing can be used to manipulate the public. And that's one of the major questions that they're addressing here. Okay, so before, like I said, before getting into their specific studies, let's talk about more generally when framing effects occur at the individual level. I think this is a good discussion in this paper, right? They don't just immediately skip the process whereby frames are affecting people. They spend a decent amount of time actually explaining the underlying psychology that's leading to a frame being effective. I think that's a good discussion. So I want to just spend some time here to again recap, and then if there's anything that maybe the wording or the way it's saying in the paper didn't come through for you, maybe this will help illustrate that. So I'll put this under the heading here. Let's see, framing effects. Occur when the consideration and I'll put this in potentially plural, could be more than one consideration. When the consideration is evoked by the frame R. Okay, so here this is, I guess, maybe not the most pithy way of putting it, but we're just saying, okay, we have a given frame. What's determining whether or not it's actually effectively driving people in one direction or another? So again, the definition of framing that I just gave you, coverage is emphasizing or de-emphasizing certain considerations. Whether or not that frame actually leads to a framing effect is dependent on what's actually going on in your head relative to the consideration being evoked. Okay, so there are actually 3 different conditions that the paper identifies. I'll talk about each of these in turn. Availability, the frame has to be available. The frame has to be accessible. The frame has to be applicable. So I'll probably mention this a few different times as we go into this discussion, but much of this maybe seems, or maybe it seems similar to what we talked about with respect to the memory-based model. These terms like accessibility in particular, I suppose, or availability. These are both things that we've talked about in that context, to where some considerations are more or less accessible. So that's something that I think it's, I'll point to a few different connections, I suppose, as we go along, that this paper makes to prior literature we've read. That's one of them, that this accessibility in particular is something that matters a lot here to the framing of considerations. Yeah, but just to go through what each of these different criteria mean. And I may or may not have to make more space depending on how many words I use, but availability is just whether or not the consideration exists in your mind. I'm just going to go ahead and make the space now. Okay, availability. The consideration exists in memory, and this is another important part, and is understood by you. Okay, so the point here just being, if a frame is evoking a consideration that you've just never encountered before, you have no idea what it is, and you don't know how to understand it, it's not going to be very effective, right? A frame has to relate to some consideration, first of all, that exists. Okay, that's I think intuitive. I don't know that we need to dwell on this point. The consideration just doesn't exist in your mind. You don't know what the frame is talking about. It's probably not going to be willing, or not going to be likely to affect your thinking on a position. Next, accessibility. Consideration is easy to recall or easy to retrieve from memory. And in this case, like I said, accessibility means pretty much the same thing it meant when we were talking about our memory-based models. Some considerations are accessed quite frequently. Some considerations maybe have been accessed very recently. These are the types of considerations that are going to be most likely to be recalled, right? So this is sort of continuing off of the availability criterion here, to where the frame has to be available, it has to exist, and the framing is going to be more successful to the extent that it's calling on a consideration that comes to mind easily. Okay, if you're foggy and it's difficult to think of what the consideration is that the framing is based around, probably a less effective frame. If the frame evokes something, a consideration that's brought to mind really instantaneously and easily, probably going to be a more effective consideration. And so these two so far are dealing largely with memory, right? Where does the frame exist and is it easy to recall? Or actually, does the consideration exist and is it easy to recall? This final criteria that Chong and Druckmann discuss here, applicability. This is getting to, I guess, the differential quality, or as we'll probably use the term more frequently, strength of a frame. Okay, so here, does the consideration make sense relative to the situation? And this is, I think, in this case, my own interpretation. They phrase the applicability term a little bit differently. I think this is what they're getting at, though, in a more simple manner. Does a consideration make sense relative to the situation? Okay, so if the frame is sort of nonsensical, or people can't relate to it, or people just don't view the argument that's being made to be very compelling, the frame may be judged to be inapplicable. Okay. If this is the case, we may be talking about a consideration that is available and accessible, but if the consideration just really doesn't fundamentally work in the context that it's being used, it may end up being a weak frame nonetheless. And I think these make sense maybe more so when we get into the discussion of the specific frames evoked in the study. Here again, this is sort of just the conceptual background for when a frame might be effective. Where we get into the discussion of strong versus weak frames, this is again something that isn't really, I don't know that it's stated explicitly, but when Chong and Druckmann talk about strong frames, I'm running out of space on the left here now. A strong frame is one way to put it is a strong frame is one that is likely to result in a framing effect. A strong frame is one that has all these three different criteria. Okay, strong frames have to be available, they have to exist, they have to be relate to an accessible consideration, and the consideration has to make sense to the people that are receiving the frame. Okay, all three of these things together lead to a strong frame. We will see instances in the studies to where there are weak frames being provided, and a weak frame is one that lacks one of these different criteria. Right? There are some frames that are weak to where there's a combination of unavailability and applicability. Okay, that's study one. There are some frames that are weak just because they're intentionally designed by the experimenters to be inapplicable. Okay, this is where the manipulation of the source comes into play, to where people sort of just view the frame pessimistically when it's sourced a certain way. Okay, so a strong frame, it has all these different things. It's probably likely to result in a framing effect. If the frame is lacking availability, accessibility, applicability, it's likely not to really result in any sort of major effect. So here again, this is the preliminary matter. Just we've talked about what is framing, what's a framing effect, and when are framing effects likely to occur, or when are they likely to be strong frames, the way we've put it here. Getting to the specifics of the paper, I mentioned here that the major contribution of this paper is getting us into this competitive framing environment. And just to go over to the actual paper, I'll probably go back and forth a few different times. Here, this is, I think, is an effective literature review and a good way to show exactly what you're reviewing as far as existing literature goes. They have a table here illustrating their literature review, which isn't necessary for any of you guys in your paper, but maybe if you're reviewing a whole bunch of studies, either in this project or some other writing you do later on, this is a good way to illustrate it, right? So we're separating at this point into, they're showing we have all this literature that focuses on one-sided framing. Okay, so we're going to give you framing along one particular side of an issue, and that's where most of the action is happening. In other words,
all the existing literature you see, these e.g., there's, meaning just, these are just examples. Most of the literature on framing, it's taking this experimental approach. We're going to show people one frame and we're going to see whether or not it affects what they're thinking on whatever the issue is. In terms of our competitive framing context, where it's not one frame, it's multiple frames, 2 frames, more than 2 frames and whatnot, the amount of literature is extremely limited. Only a couple of papers, and they mentioned in their literature review that there are reasons why these papers aren't really getting at the core of the matter anyway. So the point here is just being, my point, I should say here, getting to why I'm showing you this table is just that this paper is getting us to this competitive context, which is probably, again, a more faithful representation of the information environment in the United States of America. If we were in a country where we had state-run media or restrictions on the media, which limited the different frames that were in existence in the environment, then this paper wouldn't be probably as applicable to that sort of scenario. We live in the United States, though, to where we have constitutional protections on the press. In practice, we have very many different press outlets, and as I showed you in my example here, in practice, very often we get into this scenario where different outlets. Sorry, my Zoom overlay, I don't know if you can even see it, is acting up. Okay, hopefully you can still hear me. I always get nervous. I'm recording through Zoom and the Zoom app is doing weird things, but hopefully everything is still working. Point here, just we live in the United States, and oftentimes we do have competing frames, as I illustrated with this example. Okay, so this is the contribution to this article, that it gets you what is really, this is a 2007 article, and there's been more on competitive framing since then, but this was an article that really, it was breaking somewhat new ground as far as just looking at the competitive framing element as opposed to just static unitary framing. So that's why I would have assigned this paper as opposed to other papers, just that it does a better job here than many other papers in the literature on actually reflecting the media environment in the United States. And just to summarize briefly, this is again, having read the paper, you get more of a rich sense of exactly what's going on here. But what do we mean by competitive? Okay, in other words, what are the dynamics of competition in American media? Additionally, what are the competitive elements that are actually being studied in the experiments we're going to talk about here in a brief few moments. One, we just talked about strength. This is one of them. Okay, some frames that you encounter in the immediate environment are going to be strong. Some of them are going to be weak. Okay, so this is one way in which competition matters in the information environment, the strength of frames. Frequency is another. Okay, some frames may be encountered only one time. Some may be encountered twice, 3 times, many different times as you navigate the information environment. Okay, so strength, frequency, and finally, pairing. Okay, sometimes when you're looking at the news, you may find framing all in one direction, framing all in another direction. Sometimes you may encounter framing that's countervailing or going against the other frame. And this is something else they look at. What happens when we pair pro and con frames? What happens when we pair strong frames with strong frames or weak frames with strong frames? This is another dynamic that the experiments get at, and which we'll talk about in a second. But just when you bring different frames together, how does that affect the presence or absence or the nature of framing effects? Okay. And so this is what we mean by competition. Some frames strong, some frames weak, some frames repeated, some frames not, and then different frames going together sometimes with one another. And so this is, again, I hope just this discussion leading up to the studies, if there's anything you weren't understanding in this paper, as I mentioned that earlier, that some of the language here is more complex in the paper than perhaps it needs to be. that being said, this is a paper you'll note. One other aspect of it, it's a fairly complex experiment, and they have a healthy number of hypotheses here, 6 different ones in total, and each one you see some of them have sub-hypotheses. So the final thing I want to do here before getting into the actual study, let me try to distill this set of hypotheses down into something more reasonable for us. They've got 6. I think I'm going to distill it into 4, and then that'll slightly simplified, hopefully. Okay, so competitive framing hypotheses. Okay, so the first one, and this is going to be approached from a few different angles in their studies, but in general, strong frames are more effective than weak frames. Okay, so this first hypothesis shouldn't be anything too shocking. Okay, that when you have an argument, what we'll discuss here toward the end, I think maybe is it always simple? What's a strong frame compared to what is a weak frame? That's a separate discussion. But taking these frames in the study as they're presented, strong frames they're expected to be more effective, be more likely to have framing effects than weak frames. Nothing groundbreaking there, I would say. The next set of hypotheses here, again, I'm going to try to distill a couple of them down into one just to simplify, gets at a topic we've discussed earlier in the semester. So here's another intersection between this paper and other discussions we've had, political knowledge. Okay, so they're discussing in a couple of different ways how political knowledge might affect voter response to framing. Okay, so here are a couple of different ways. So specifically now, when we're talking about weak frames, either weak frames or repeated frames, will affect those low in knowledge or motivation, which I'll talk about these 2 different terms one second. Low in knowledge and motivation than those who are high in knowledge or motivation. The insight here, I think this is somewhat intuitive. If you're somebody who, if a weak frame, a repeated frame, if you're somebody who is very thoughtful and you know a lot about politics and you like to think about politics, you're more likely to recognize the frame as weak, or you're less likely to be swayed by just mere repetition of the frame. And this is good, right? We would, again, normatively probably not want people to be swayed by weak arguments or weak frames or just mere repetition. Okay, that's probably something we would like most people not to judge their political views on. To the extent that this is going to happen, it's going to be more so among people who don't know much about politics. They don't think about politics that much. They don't want to put that much effort into thinking about politics. And so they're perhaps going to be more easily swayed by these weaker frames or just repeating the frame. That's, again, combining a few of the different hypotheses that Chang and Druckmann have listed out of those 6. Next hypothesis here that I'm going to summarize, and this is, again, going to involve motivation or knowledge. Motivation, I have this, just as I said, I have knowledge / motivation. Really what's going on in the paper is conceptually they're more interested in motivation, but the way motivation is being measured is by knowledge. So I'm sort of conflating these 2 terms, which aren't exactly the same, but they're very highly correlated with one another. So this is something that probably concerns me more than you guys and my perspective than yours. But anyway, continuing on, The next hypothesis involves what is known as contrast effects, and how those relate to motivation / knowledge. Okay, so contrast effects is the idea whereby, again, getting to these competitive dynamics, you pair a strong frame going in one direction with a weak frame going in the other direction. Okay, it's not going to be just the strong frame having an effect and the weak frame not having an effect. Potentially, the weak frame might backfire if it's juxtaposed with a much better frame. Right? So a contrast effect, you take a really strong argument and pair it with a really weak argument that's having more of an effect than just the strong effect on its own, the strong frame on its own. That's a contrast effect. Right? So here's strong versus weak frames. Actually, let me specify further. Countervailing. In a situation where you have frames that are going in different directions, pro and con, and varying in terms of their strength. Contrast effects, again, the weak frame backfiring, in other words. These are going to occur specifically among those that are high in knowledge and motivation. So, I mean, again, I think this is fairly intuitive. I think my mail's being delivered if you hear something in the background. So I think this is a fairly intuitive argument, right? If you're somebody who's very thoughtful about politics, you're motivated to think about what you're actually hearing. The pairing, getting the weak frame maybe causes you to think more about the strong frame. Okay, so it isn't something that you would probably expect to find in somebody who is just not really that interested about politics or thinking about politics, who's not really having a deep, thoughtful process when they encounter information. This sort of effect probably is going to be characteristic of those who specifically are thoughtful about politics. So again, we're invoking knowledge and motivation. And so one final hypothesis I wanted to talk about, which I think is really interesting, and maybe undersold a little bit in the paper, and its implications relative to other literature, other theories, and public opinion. So here's one thing, just to, before I get to that hypothesis, exactly what it's stating. I have open in my browser my Tabor and Lodge paper, which I'll refer back to here on a few different points, I think. But if this isn't ringing any bells immediately, this is the paper we read about motivated reasoning, where again, the overall point is that motivated reasoning means those who have predispositions on an issue, when they encounter new information, their thought processes are going to be oriented primarily towards preserving or reinforcing their predispositions. So here, we broke this down into the prior attitude effect. Okay, we talked about disconfirmation bias, confirmation bias, various different ways in which motivated reasoning can occur, where again, I'll probably discuss these different types of biases, maybe in a little bit more detail as they become relevant to our framing paper. But we would expect, based on this and based on a whole host of other papers in a bunch of different areas in public opinion and political psychology, we would expect that by and large people are going to be viewing information or framing through the lens of their own prior views or prior predispositions. What we actually see here, though, in this paper, what they're hypothesizing, I guess I'll spoil it that this is the actual result we see as well. But Chong and Druckerman are hypothesizing that competing strong frames will moderate attitudes. So if you're somebody who is just maybe based on that Tabor and Lodge article on motivated reasoning, if I were to ask you, just as a hypothetical, not you, but if I were to ask a person, you give somebody a pro argument and a con argument, how are they going to process that? My answer, or the hypothetical person who just read Tabor and Lodge, their answer would be, well, if they were already pro, they would stay pro, or if they were already con, they would stay con. They wouldn't necessarily say, based on a motivated reasoning perspective, that their views would moderate. And motivated reasoning actually predicts the opposite, that sometimes people could strengthen their attitudes based on countervailing information. In this case, Chong and Drucken are sort of taking an argument that's against the motivated reasoning theory, which again, I said, I think it's somewhat understated in the article, but this is, in effect, an argument against, at least in this context, competing strong frames. Motivated reasoning might not be in effect. It might actually lead to something between the pro and the con frame, where you eventually land on the issue. This is interesting. We'll talk about the actual results here as we go along on this note and these other notes. So this is just me attempting to simplify their expectations a little bit. Strong frames are going to be more effective than weak frames. In the context of a weak frame or a repeated frame, it may be effective, but only among those who are low in knowledge. These contrast effects, and these are only going to occur among those that are high in knowledge. And then moderation when we encounter strong frames that are going against one another. There are other things that they predict in their hypotheses, but these are the expectations I'm going to focus on as we wrap up our discussion here and get into the survey, the experiment, and the results. So let's talk about the empirical approach here. This would be, again, I would say, a good example of an experiment that some of you guys may probably not with this degree of complexity, but might think about running. It's getting to the point of being too late, I suppose, but in your final projects, right? This is a good example of an experiment that's the core. It's complex in the number of conditions and all the things that are going on, but the nature of the treatment is pretty simple. They're just giving these articles for people to read, which are framing the stories in different ways that the experimenters are manipulating. So it's fairly simple in the nature of the treatments. Where it gets complex is just the amount of treatments and what the various different manipulations that are happening. But yeah, it's a good example of an experiment. And in this case, again, it was a lab experiment. So this is an experiment to where they're bringing their subjects into a fixed location and having them all take the survey in that location. But it could have very easily occurred in a survey experiment, the type of thing that you guys are designing for your projects. I guess the first thing this isn't something I want to spend a ton of time talking about, but they do these two experiments, and their sample frame involves students and adults from the university population. As I mentioned, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this point, but it's just worth noting here. This is probably the disadvantage of a lab experiment. There are advantages in terms of the degree of control, and sometimes the cost is less in a lab setting. The disadvantage here is that very often you're going to be relegated to this sort of sample. You're recruiting people to come into your university political psychology lab and take an experiment. You're going to be very often limited to just the students on the university, and sometimes adults you can supplement the sample with who will also at the university, either working or for whatever reason. But this is not a representative sample, so that's one thing that it's not, in this case, I wouldn't say a huge issue, right? It's something that ideally would have a representative sample of the population of the electorate, the American electorate, in other words. In this case, we're dealing with framing effects which fundamentally, as we talked about, rely on these psychological underpinnings to where the human mind, more or less, whether we're talking about an adult, a person of this race or that race, or a person of this age or that age, or a person of this region or that region, human psychology, more or less, to simplify it a lot, more or less works the same regardless of who you are. And so in this case, given that we're fundamentally studying a psychological process. It's not as urgent to have a fully representative sample, but it is more ideal than this. But to their credit, they have a large sample, which is required given the really extensive amount of conditions they have in their experiment. Like I said, I didn't want to dwell too much on this, but I just wanted to point that out in terms of the advantages or disadvantages of a lab versus a survey experiment. The main advantage of a survey experiment, of course, being that it's easier to have a broad or representative sample than in a lab, a central location. Okay. So here, I'm going to talk a little bit about each study separately, but I'm going to probably summarize the results collectively just to avoid getting into too much minutia of these different studies. So we have these two different studies. They're different in a couple of different ways that I think are important to note. First of all, study one, the topic is urban growth. I'm actually going to leave a couple of lines just to be cautious. Study two, on the other hand, this is dealing with the hate group rally, which I believe both of these are hypothetical, so made up policy issues from what I recall about the article, that they have resonance in terms of their actual questions in the world about urban growth and hate speech and free speech and whatnot, but I don't think these are specifically referencing some actual policy debate that was going on. Okay, so the urban growth. So both of these studies are separating subjects into different types of frames, different numbers, different strengths. I think here, as I talk through this, it probably makes sense to actually reference, as an example, one of these figures they provide. I'll go to page 6. I think it's page 8, excuse me. So here you see they have this table, and there are other tables that are similar to this one, where they're showing all their experimental conditions. You have, I think the most simple way to explain it would be, in each condition, of which there are a total of 16. So you see we go up to 16 conditions here, a lot. But anyway, each condition is a combination, some number of pro frames. So in this case, we're talking about the urban growth policy, where the policy in question is, should we centralize all of our growth into one area? Okay. Should we centralize urban growth? You have some number of pro frames between 0 and 2. You're getting either 0, 1, or 2 pro frames, and then 0, 1, or 2 con frames. Okay, so there's some combination of number of different frames going in either direction. There are also combinations of strength. Okay, so you see strong pro, weak pro, strong con, weak con. Okay, so you've got all these different combinations of pro and con, 0, 1, or 2, and strong and weak. All these different combinations are giving you all these different conditions. Okay, so here's 0, 0. You're not getting any frames. Just as some example here, if we were to go to, let's say, condition 6, just as an example, you're getting 1 weak pro frame and 1 weak con frame. Here, I'm just going for more examples. You're getting 2 strong frames paired with 1 weak frame. Okay. So again, these are all just getting to these competitive dynamics we discussed, to where you have all these different conditions, and they're combining different combinations of strength, number, and direction. And then they're going to take all this information from these frames, from these different conditions, and figure out, how does the dynamic of strong versus weak work? How does the dynamic involving the number of the frames work? How does the dynamic involving the direction work in combination with all these things? So you have a very complex, in terms of the number and types of conditions, a very complex experiment, which I am going to try to simplify the results of here. If you're somebody who understands regression, for instance, you've taken statistics class or whatnot, I believe these are, I don't remember what model they use. It may just be a normal regression. It may be These are probit. If you're somebody who probably, even if you've just taken one statistics class, you probably aren't familiar with interpreting probit results. But if you're somebody who has a very rich understanding of statistics, or at least a moderately advanced understanding of statistics, you would perhaps make sense of these results. If not, I think the authors do a reasonable job of discussing what they find in the text, and I'll try to do, again, simplify a lot of what they're saying in my own notes. The one other thing before getting to the results I wanted to point out, you have this strength manipulation. So each frame is going to be either strong or weak. Okay, we've talked about this before. What makes a frame weak? What makes a frame strong? I think it's interesting here just the way that they're manipulating strength in these two studies. In study one, the manipulation, just strength. There are different arguments in the frames, which vary based on their applicability or availability. So a couple of different things being varied. Okay, whereas here in the hate group rally, they're manipulating the strength of the frame by its source. And again, I don't want to get bogged down in the minutia of the study too much, but here there's this figure, table 2. It's giving you how this works out. In the urban growth, the centralization policy, the strong frame involves, we need to preserve our open space. The weak frame involves, the con frame, the strong con frame involves saving on economic costs. That this centralization policy will make overall development cost more than if we spread out the development. Those are strong frames. The weak frames are, this policy of centralizing everyone will build a stronger community. The weak con frame is that maybe voters just aren't able to understand the issue. They're not confident enough to deal with it. And the way that they're getting at strong versus weak in this case is that they're running a pretest. You heard that mentioned in this paper a little bit. The pretest is just a separate survey that's sent out. These would be different people that actually end up taking the actual experiment. It's just a pretest whereby people are rating whether or not these arguments are compelling, right? So the pretest, they're testing to see, are people responsive to open space or economic costs? Do people think these are good arguments? And the pretest reveals that these are the two arguments that are strong, preserving the open space and the economic costs. And these are the two that are weak, building the community and voter competence. And I don't know if any of you in your projects have pre-tests in mind, but that is sometimes useful just to get a sense of how your subjects will eventually react to your treatments. And then in the hate rally, this would be study 2, strong versus weak is manipulated based on the source. Okay, who is actually providing the information? Is it a relatively credible outlet making the case? The Star Tribune, I believe, was the local newspaper, the actual newspaper, whereas West Side Story, this was a high school newspaper. Okay, so there are different levels of credibility there. And in this case, the actual frames are being held constant. They're the same in the weak and strong condition. So it's the free speech argument or the public safety argument on the con side. What's actually being manipulated in terms of the strength is just where the information is coming from. Okay, is the source a credible source or a non-credible source? And again, I don't know if I've been successful. I'm trying to avoid overly complicating everything. That's what I wanted to talk about as far as the design here. Let me summarize the findings a little bit, and then I want to wrap up just by referencing some of what you guys said on your QQCs, which I thought was interesting, and some other broader thoughts, I suppose, as well that I had. I didn't write a QQC, of course, but I have some things I wanted to discuss just to summarize the findings. What are the findings? A lot of this is going to mirror what we talked about with respect to our hypotheses. So here, again, not in the realm of really shocking findings, but strength matters more than repetition. When you give someone a strong argument, it's likely to be an effective frame. Weak arguments, not so effective, and repeating the same argument over and over again. Generally speaking, not that effective. One thing here, though, I will say this is again getting back to confirming the hypotheses. Weak frames, or let's say weak or repetitive frames, sometimes, not in all the different analyses if you followed along with the paper, but sometimes affect those low in knowledge and motivation. So sometimes meaning you can look at the analysis and the statistics, the patterns, the covariance. Sometimes you see weaker repetitive frames influencing those who are low in knowledge. Not all the time, so it's not a super consistent result. Here again, getting in to the sometimes rather than just fully clean results. Sometimes there are contrast effects among those high in knowledge. Yeah, so there's some evidence that these contrast effects occur, but it doesn't seem that it's always going to be the case. That's my reading of the results. That it seems pretty clear. I'm not going to go back to the table of results, but there are some cells of results that very strongly bear out these contrast effects, and others to where you don't really see much of an effect. And so there's potentially something going on behind the scenes that bears more study than this. That the contrast effect seems to have some legitimacy, but we don't fully get a sense of exactly what the conditions are that lead to these effects. And again, something that potentially, I don't know, I'm not familiar whether or not the authors have studied this more subsequent to this paper, but it's something that definitely is worth more study. When exactly do these contrast effects emerge? Next, competing frames. And this is one that in which the results are pretty uniform, so I won't put a sometimes here. Competing frames, let's see, actually strong frames specifically. I want to make sure I'm getting a fair summary of the paper. Competing strong frames. Moderate attitudes. Okay, so if you're somebody who's getting a strong pro frame matched with a strong con frame, what's more or less happening is that your ultimate position on the issue is somewhere in between the pro and the con. So this is something I wanted to just spend a moment talking about here. And so going back to, I mentioned I was going to reference this Tabor and Lodge paper a little bit. So going back to this, one thing we've talked about is at a few different points in time in this lesson is this disconfirmation bias. Okay, the idea that this paper, Tabor and Lodge theorizes and finds that when people are confronted with contrasting arguments to their own position, well, usually what happen is that they will throw out whatever disagrees with their predisposition and sort of disregard the effect and stay where they are, or sometimes even get more strongly embedded in their own views. And so here, when we get into what Chong and Druckmann are finding, it's kind of a contrast between these two different papers. Okay, this paper, Tabor and Lodge, and this idea of disconfirmation bias suggests that when somebody encounters an argument that runs against their predispositions, they should throw it out. So here, in other words, what the way this paper measures, for instance, study one, okay, their primary measure of predispositions here is something like this, 7-point scale Okay, to where they're asking, let me just, rather than write it up here, maybe I'll just read it off of the paper, the exact wording, page 8 of the PDF. Okay, so they're asking you before before you're exposed to the treatment, they're asking you this question in general: what do you think is more important? Protecting the environment, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, or maintaining a prosperous economy? And you're answering this on a 7-point scale, to where the right end of the scale is you think the economy is a lot more important. The left end of the scale, the environment is a lot more important. And then you're getting asked this question afterwards: do you support or oppose this policy, the centralization policy, to where the argument in favor of it involves centralization. It involves protecting the environment, keeping these areas that are not in the centralized developed zone undeveloped, protecting the environment there. Or do you oppose decentralization, where the primary con is economic cost? So the point is just this, right? So you're getting asked a separate question after the treatment, again on a 7-point scale. Do you want centralization or decentralization? The point is just this here. Imagine you're somebody who is a 7, you strongly favor the economy. Okay, the motivated reasoning and argument would just say, whatever frame you get, it could be a centralization frame, a decentralization frame, you're going to stay here at the end. Okay? You're gonna pick 7. What's actually happening though is when you give people the strong decentralization frame and the strong centralization frame, in other words, the strong pro and the strong con, they're ending up somewhere in the middle here, okay, which is interesting to me. I don't know if it stayed when you read this paper. I don't know if it all stood out as such a contrast to our prior research as I think it is. But it seems to be a lot more of an optimistic look on how people are processing this information than Tabor and Lodge would give us, right? They're not just throwing out the view that disagrees with their predisposition and keeping their prior view. They're actually integrating their view into the competing frames into their view and coming out with a posterior evaluation that is more moderate than what they entered into. So I think that was interesting. It's not something to where I think based on one paper we're throwing out the entirety of the motivated reasoning argument, but it is something just notable in terms of contrasting this paper with prior research that we've had in the semester. And the final thing here, I guess, as far as the findings go, this is not pointing specifically to one particular pattern in the data, but rather just a broad summary that the authors come to. Again, in terms of optimistic findings, competition between frames, should be a W, between frames, encourages conscious deliberation. So, the way they get at this is, you take these scenarios in which they're having these frames compete against one another. Sometimes we see people thinking it through and arriving at these contrast effects. Sometimes we see people taking these competing frames and thinking about them and coming to a more moderate view than they entered into the experiment with. These sort of patterns in the data suggest that when you're encountering these competing ideas, you're thinking about them. Okay, it's causing you to reconsider the issue and consciously deliberate over it, which is, again, from a normative perspective, probably something that most people would value, right? That people are thinking about politics and putting some thought into their political views. So in that sense, the overall prescription of this paper is that having all the sides of an issue represented in the media and in the information environment more broadly, that's a good thing. It's leading to potentially depolarization if we buy this finding, which I want to talk more about in a second, whether we buy it fully. Potentially depolarization in one's views, potentially just broadly speaking, more deliberation over politics. Okay, so the overall recommendation of this paper is that we should, to the extent possible, allow for all of our different views to be represented in the media. All right. So that about wraps up what I wanted to talk about on this paper's findings and the paper in general. What I wanted to close out with here is just talking about some of the concerns you guys had in your QQCs, and some of these that I'm going to mention also relate to things thoughts I had as I was reading through the paper again. I think this is the first time I've read this paper in a couple of years at least. So interesting to come back to things you've read before and get a sense of how think what you remember and how your views have changed on it. But anyway, so a lot of you talked about this finding that I emphasize. You take these competing strong frames and they end up moderating your attitudes. In other words, another way to put it, people are willing to listen to the other side's arguments, even if there's somebody who comes into the experiment and they have a specific strong point of view. They're willing to listen and perhaps give heed and think about the other side's arguments, which again, this stands in contrast to our motivated reasoning account, which we talked about earlier in the semester. Some of you mentioned, and I thought this was a good point, that perhaps this finding on the moderation of attitudes, maybe that's a function of the specific issues that are used in these studies. Again, I think this is a good insight. These issues aren't the most divisive, I don't think. Certainly people would have different attitudes on them, but if you look at, especially study 1, and this is primarily where this finding is coming from, the environment versus the economy, the decentralization versus centralization of urban development. This is probably not an issue that most people have extremely rigid or strong views on. It's probably not an issue where people get emotionally invested like other issues that we can think of. In other words, it's maybe not the most divisive issue. It's maybe also not an issue that has clear partisan battle lines drawn between it. And so some of you mentioned that maybe the finding here, again, which is primarily based on results from study 1, this urban planning question, maybe the issue here is what's driving the moderation of attitudes more so than more so than this being a broader pattern we would expect if we look at the other issues. So if we were to do this in the context of a very divisive issue, maybe abortion or something like that. Abortion, I guess, is the go-to in terms of divisive issues in contemporary politics. Perhaps we would not see these moderation of attitudes. Perhaps we'd see something more akin to our disconfirmation bias, which we talked about a few different times by now. That is one comment. Another related to this. Some of you wrote about ambivalence, that maybe people came into this issue with respect to urban planning more ambivalent than other issues. Okay, so where maybe you are more able to maybe it's usually to where the balance of consideration is more even than other issues, which I think is related to the overall point here. Again, good points, I think. I mentioned this earlier, and I don't recall whether this is, I have my notes written down on a separate screen. I don't recall if this is something that came from one of your QQCs or just something that I thought about. But we're talking about the strength of frames. Okay, strong frames outweigh weak frames. And in this case, they're assessing the strength of the frame through a pretest where they're giving people, again, just to go back to the chart, they're giving people on the pro side, this preservation of open space being the strong argument for urban centralization, and then this weak frame of building community. Again, where this is coming from, just a pretest of the various ratings of this by pretest respondents. Maybe there's more, again, maybe if we get into other issues, there's more ambiguity as far as what constitutes a strong frame and a weak frame. So again, if we reference our Tabor and Lodge paper, this isn't something that we can directly, that the Chong and Drucklin paper directly responds to. But they talk about this prior attitude effect, okay, where people who feel strongly about an issue will evaluate supportive arguments as stronger and more compelling than opposing arguments. So they're saying here that maybe there's a whole suite of issues, maybe not urban planning, but maybe other issues to where there's not going to be really any widespread agreement on what's a strong frame and what's a not strong, a weak frame. And again, this is an area in which when we try to generalize this paper, perhaps it breaks down a little bit. Just maybe these findings aren't as applicable where there aren't clear and clean categories of strong versus weak frames. Okay, when we get into our prior attitude effect, maybe there's a lot more disagreement on what's strong and what's weak based on one's prior views. And then finally, again, I'm getting into things I don't recall whether it was your comments or mine or a combination of them. Here again, we're in an experimental context to where it's the experimenter giving the frame to the subject, and so we know exactly what the subject is getting, and by we I mean them, the experimenters, Chang and Druckmann. Another aspect of Tabor and Lodge I think is relevant to this is this confirmation bias, to where when we get into the actual environment, and this is at play, our confirmation bias, in other words, selective exposure, okay, just to jog your memories, selective exposure, when this is at play, okay, is this at this level, is our motivated reasoning perhaps going against what this paper is suggesting? So if we're in a situation in which people, by their own approach to the information environment, are avoiding anything that's going against their views, so they're not actually receiving this balance of strong pro and strong con, they're, in other words, cutting out of the equation the side that disagrees with them. Perhaps this moderation effect does not actually occur in practice if we're to believe our confirmation bias is occurring. Okay, so this is, we can, if we wanted to, we could probably put an asterisk that there were a lot of questions left to be answered about the generalizability of this pattern when we try to take it out of just the experimental context of this paper and apply it more broadly. So yeah, thanks for your QQC comments. Thanks for remaining attentive to the readings. I think they're valuable to talk about here. And that's what I wanted to conclude with as far as this paper goes. If you have any questions about this paper, either confusion about what I've said or anything else you wanted to talk about, please get in touch with me and I'd be happy to. I'll leave you with this, our final reading of the semester, Mutz and Reeves. I have that one open, I believe, to show you. Yeah, so this is a paper about how incivility influences people's thoughts on government or politics, generally speaking. So specifically it's about trust, but I'll probably bring a little bit more to the table than just the findings on trust from specifically other work by Diana Mutz. But this is a paper I think that's interesting. It again is using an experiment to study how media coverage and differences in what people are seeing in the media perhaps lead to different attitudinal response. In this case, it's talking about televised incivility. This is a 2005 paper, but you'll get to reading it and you'll recognize, I think, that it's not television specifically that matters, but just audio-visual presentation in general. Right? The fundamental argument underlying this paper is that people respond at a level when they see on video incivility the same way as if they were in person seeing it. So it's not specifically television. It's something that we would expect a lot of these findings. I think if you watched a video on the internet, if you watched a video, I don't know if there are any other contexts beyond television, the internet, but video in general when you see incivility in a video format, it's leading you towards certain responses with respect to political trust that the authors will talk about. I think this is an interesting paper, probably easier to follow than the Chang and Druckmann. There are a lot fewer experimental conditions. I think they're maybe a little bit more straightforward in their conceptual discussion. On this paper, I'm not going to require a QQC. It's something that you'll want to eventually read it when you get the chance. Just for the final exam coming up, we will, that would be the relevance of it to you beyond the QQC. So I'll have a video lecture for this next week. You'll read it when you get the chance next week. Your final project is what's taking precedence in the immediate term, which is why I'm not assigning a QQC for this. So again, I'll give you, I guess, now the final reminder. Please get in touch with me if you need to on anything with respect to your project. I'll be available to talk about it up until the due date. Otherwise, thanks everyone. I hope you're all hanging in there again with the quarantine. I assume most of you are quarantined still. I'll see you next week, or at least talk to you next week. Have a good weekend. It's Friday now when I'm recording this, so have a good weekend. Or if you don't hear it until Monday or next week, have a good day, whatever day, evening, or whatnot it is. All right, everyone, bye. Good luck with your projects. See you later.